They called him just Eddie. Not Mr. Jameson, not Sir, just Eddie. The kind of name people use when they've already decided you don't matter. Eddie Jameson, 74, worked the west gate at Worthington Military Academy. Every morning at 5:45 sharp, he arrived in a faded security jacket with a patched name tag, a steaming thermos in hand, and a calm nod for every cadet who passed. Most didn't return it. He walked to work, always. To the young officers and cadets, he was invisible. An old man with creaky knees, a clipboard, and outdated ideas. Some whispered jokes behind his back. Others didn't even whisper. Lieutenant Carter, one of the Academy's rising stars, once quipped, "Bet he thinks Morse code still wins wars." Eddie said nothing. What they didn't know, what no one bothered to ask, was that he once led hundreds across foreign soil under moonless skies, that he carried medals in a shoebox under his bed, that his silence wasn't weakness. It was experience choosing not to waste itself. At lunch, he sat alone. Same meal every day. Black coffee, a sandwich, one apple. His notebook always nearby, filled with observations no one knew he was making. He didn't talk much, but he saw everything. Cadet Aria Bennett was one of the few who noticed. She had saluted him on her first day. He had returned it without hesitation. "My father said never judge a man by his title," she told him. "Smart father," Eddie replied. She watched as he moved, measured, precise, never in a hurry. She noticed how he scanned the tree line when others stared at their phones, how he tested the gate latch 3 times before logging off. The others dismissed him, but she saw something else. Not a man stuck in the past, a man waiting. And waiting, she would soon learn, was not inaction, it was preparation. Eddie's hands told a story no one at Worthington bothered to read. Calloused palms, scarred knuckles, a slight tremor when the weather turned cold, not from age, but from night missions in mountain terrain decades ago. They were hands that had once lifted wounded men from burning vehicles, hands that had unfolded maps in underground bunkers, hands that had signed orders sending brave soldiers into danger. Now they checked IDs and filled out maintenance reports. At night, in his small apartment 3 miles from campus, those same hands would sometimes open the shoebox he kept beneath his bed. Inside, medals rested in neat rows on faded velvet. Distinguished Service Cross, bronze stars, purple hearts, commendations from generals whose names had long since entered history books. Eddie never displayed them, never mentioned them. The honors remained hidden, just like the photographs tucked beneath them. Eddie standing tall in dress uniform, Eddie in desert fatigues alongside teams of elite operators, Eddie shaking hands with presidents. He'd served in conflicts most of these cadets only read about in textbooks, led missions so classified the files remained sealed, developed tactics still taught in war colleges across the country. The notebook he carried, the one they mocked, contained insights earned through blood and sacrifice. Sometimes, when night terrors jolted him awake, he'd sit at his kitchen table until dawn, writing recommendations the Academy would never request, improvements they'd never implement until they had to. On his dresser sat a single-framed photo. 5 men in combat gear, arms around shoulders, faces grimy but smiling. Only Eddie remained alive from that group. He'd outlived commanders, outlived presidents, outlived wars. Now he outlived respect. Every morning he'd straighten his faded security jacket, clip his badge, and prepare his thermos. Without ceremony, without recognition, he'd leave his medals behind and walk to his post. The quiet guardian of a gate whose importance only he truly understood. Eddie Jameson didn't need their acknowledgement. He'd earned his place in history long before Lieutenant Carter learned to tie his boots. The young officer's mockery was nothing compared to the enemies he'd faced, the decisions he'd made, the men he'd buried. Just Eddie became more than a name. It was an invisibility cloak he wore daily. In the Academy's busy hallways, Officers would nod to each other with formal lieutenant or captain acknowledgements while he passed by unnoticed. The cadets had specific names too: Cadet Bennett, Cadet Washington, Cadet Michaels. These titles carried weight, promise, future. But for him, it was always the casual dismissal, "Hey, Eddie," or "Morning, Eddie" on good days. More often, nothing at all. He remembered when titles mattered, when Commander Jameson commanded rooms silent with a single glance, when "Sir" followed his every order without hesitation, when his name in mission briefings caused even hardened operators to straighten their posture. That respect had dissolved into this strange familiarity that wasn't actually familiarity at all. It was forgetting he existed beyond his function. The gate opened, the gate closed. Eddie was there, then he wasn't. A fixture, like the flagpole, or the academy sign. In the cafeteria, he'd hear them sometimes, the young instructors discussing leadership presence and command authority, while their eyes passed over him as if he were empty space. The irony might have made him laugh if it didn't reveal so much about what they valued. His name badge had once read E. Jameson Security. But after it was damaged in the rain last spring, the replacement came back simply labeled Eddie. He noticed. No one else did. Sometimes during night shifts, when the academy grounds fell silent except for distant barracks chatter, he'd whisper his full name to himself. Colonel Edward James Jameson, Special Operations Command. Just to remember who he had been, who he still was beneath the weathered security jacket. Cadet Bennett once asked him, "Doesn't it bother you when they call you just Eddie?" He'd looked at her, this rare cadet who somehow saw through the veil of invisibility, and smiled slightly. "Names don't make the man," he'd told her. "Actions do." But in the quiet moments, in the solitude of his rounds, even Eddie sometimes wondered if he'd disappeared entirely into the diminutive name they'd given him. Lieutenant Daniel Carter was Academy royalty, West Point graduate, decorated twice before 30, perfect uniform, perfect posture, perfect smile. His family had military pedigree going back 4 generations. When he spoke, cadets leaned forward. When he walked, junior officers made way. His confidence wasn't just worn, it was weaponized, and he had decided Eddie Jameson made the perfect target. "Morning, museum piece," he'd call as he passed the west gate, not bothering to wait for a response. "Still using that paper logbook?" The 1980s called. They want their security protocols back. Eddie would nod, nothing more. This only emboldened Carter. In the officers' lounge, Carter developed a routine. Eddie Jameson stories, delivered with theatrical flair to appreciative laughter. "Saw the old man actually using a compass yesterday. A physical compass. Probably doesn't trust GPS because it wasn't invented when dinosaurs roamed the earth." Or asked Eddie if he wanted to join the digital security briefing. "He thought I meant watching our fingers count to 10. The older officers would chuckle politely. The younger ones laughed without restraint. No one defended the gate guard. Why would they? He was just Eddie. One rainy Tuesday, Carter approached the security booth where Eddie sat reviewing his notebook. He leaned against the doorframe, watching with exaggerated curiosity. What's in there anyway? Bird watching. Deer. Diary entries. Or are you actually taking notes on our super-classified cadet marching patterns? Eddie closed the book, met Carter's gaze. Just observations. What could you possibly observe that our $1 million security system doesn't? Eddie placed the notebook in his pocket. People, Lieutenant. I observe people. Carter's laugh echoed across the empty parade ground. Well, keep up the good work, Eddie. Good to know someone's watching for threat-level jaywalking. As he walked away, Carter called over his shoulder, "Some advice? Retirement? It's a thing. Look into it." Eddie resumed his post, expression unchanged. The mockery was nothing new, nothing compared to what he'd endured before. The officers' break room became the epicenter of Eddie folklore, where stories grew with each telling. Each day brought a new joke, a fresh observation, another reason to dismiss the old man at the gate. "I walked by Eddie's post yesterday," Lieutenant Reeves said, stirring his coffee. He was actually using a physical map to check the perimeter. Paper, with a pencil, making marks like it's 1975. Captain Williams laughed. "That explains the regular patrols. He's probably looking for Soviet spies." "Did you know he brings the same lunch every day?" chimed in Lieutenant Garcia. "Same sandwich, same apple. Like he's rationing supplies for the Cold War." The room filled with chuckles. A new cadet instructor, fresh from deployment, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Lieutenant Carter, always ready to escalate, pulled out his phone. "Watch this. I took a video yesterday when he didn't know I was there." The group huddled around the screen, watching Eddie meticulously checking the fence line, testing each lock 3 times, scanning the tree line with practiced precision. "Look at this dinosaur," Carter laughed. "Bet he thinks drones are science. Fiction. Should we tell him about satellite surveillance or let him keep playing Boy Scout?" The jokes continued through lunch shifts, coffee breaks, staff meetings. Eddie's methodical routine became punchline material, his notebook a particular source of amusement. "Secret military intelligence," one would say with exaggerated seriousness. "Tracking squirrel movements," another would respond. Maybe it's his memoir, Gate Duty, My Life Watching Others Serve. Only when General Langston occasionally passed through did the laughter subside, replaced by discussions of tactical doctrine and upcoming training. The whispers would return the moment she left. None of them noticed how, during these conversations, several cadets had stopped laughing, how Cadet Bennett's jaw tightened when Eddie's name came up, how a small group had begun treating the old security guard with quiet deference, and none of them, not even Carter, realized that Eddie could hear every word through the thin wall, separating the break room from the maintenance closet where he stored his equipment. He heard, he remembered. He said nothing. The notebook was nothing special, worn leather cover, yellowed pages, spiral binding with one coil slightly bent. Eddie carried it everywhere, tucked in his left breast pocket or open on his knee during quiet moments. His handwriting filled each page, neat, precise lettering that belonged to another era. They'd made assumptions about its contents: retirement countdown, medication schedule, grocery lists. Lieutenant Carter had even staged dramatic readings of what he imagined. Eddie wrote, "Dear Diary, today I guarded a gate again." But no one had actually seen inside. No one except Cadet Bennett, who'd glimpsed a page one morning while delivering schedule changes to the security booth. What she saw wasn't ramblings or mundane observations. The pages contained detailed security assessments, meticulously drawn diagrams of the academy grounds with sight lines, blind spots, and response times marked in different colors. Notes on pattern recognition, weather conditions affecting perimeter visibility, staff rotations with vulnerability windows highlighted. One section tracked behavior changes in regular visitors. The delivery driver, who'd started arriving 11 minutes later than his 6-month average. The groundskeeper, who'd begun parking closer to the administrative building. The new habit of cadets congregating near the southeast fence during shift changes. Maps showed approach vectors, defensive positions, evacuation routes, all hand-drawn with military precision. Times were logged to the second. Every entry cross-referenced prior observations. Small notations appeared in the margins. Southeast. Camera 3, 7-ground misalignment since 9/17. Westgate Hydraulics 3, 4-second delay, up from 2-1 last month. Command radio frequency clear but intermittent static at 22, Zanu 22-17 daily. And unlike the sophisticated security system that occasionally glitched during storms, Eddie's observations never stopped. His records continued through power failures and system resets, creating an unbroken chain of awareness no computer could match. Bennett had only seen a single page before Eddie gently closed the book. But it was enough. "That's not just notes," she'd said quietly. Eddie had regarded her thoughtfully before answering. "The most dangerous assumption in security," he'd replied, "is that you've seen everything worth seeing." The ritual was always the same. At the beginning of each shift, Eddie Jameson would approach the west gate and tap the metal frame 3 times with his knuckles. Not hard, not frantically, just 3 measured, deliberate taps. Then he'd pause, listening for the subtle resonance that followed. Only then would he unlock the mechanism and begin his day. Cadets found it amusing. Some mimicked the gesture behind his back. Lieutenant Carter had an entire routine built around it, complete with exaggerated old man shuffling and mumbled superstitions. "It's like watching history," Carter once proclaimed to his audience in the mess hall. Pre-technological security check. Probably learned it from a medieval gatekeeper. But Cadet Bennett had noticed something the others missed. Eddie didn't. Tap randomly. He struck specific points along the frame, points where the metal joined, where the electronic sensors connected to the main security system, where the hydraulic hinges attached. Each tap produced a slightly different sound. Each sound told him something about the gate's condition. The morning the Academy's sophisticated system failed to detect a loose connection in the southwest sensor array, Eddie knew before the first alarm test. 3 taps had told him what thousands of dollars in diagnostics would later confirm. When the third shift officer asked him about it during handover, Eddie simply shrugged. "Metal remembers," he said, "if you listen." The young officer had laughed, chalking it up to old man nonsense. Yet the next morning he found himself watching Eddie's ritual with new interest. 3 taps, a pause, a slight tilt of the head. What the Academy didn't know, what Eddie never bothered to explain, was that this same technique had once saved 37 lives in a mountain passage halfway around the world. A metal door that should have sounded one way but resonated differently. A trap avoided because someone had listened to what others deemed primitive. The cadets kept laughing. Eddie kept tapping. And each day, the West Gate remained the only entry point that never once failed a security check. 3 taps. Simple, reliable, invisible to those who valued complexity over consistency. The first warning came in late August, a minor fluctuation in the perimeter sensors. The automated system logged it as a weather anomaly. Eddie's notebook recorded it as a potential probe. The second alert followed 2 weeks later, a 3-second camera freeze on the east fence. Technical support attributed it to software updating. Eddie documented the precise time, conditions, and the shadow that moved across frame 4. 2 seconds before the freeze, he filed reports through proper channels. Maintenance requests, security observations. Each one entered the Academy's sleek digital system, assigned a tracking number, and promptly buried under higher priorities. No one wanted to waste resources investigating an old man's hunches. "System, working within acceptable parameters," came the standard response. On September 12th, Eddie left a handwritten note on Lieutenant Carter's desk. "Southeast quadrant vulnerable. Camera angles compromised. Request immediate review." Carter had laughed, crumpled the paper, and tossed it toward the trash. He missed. The note lay forgotten beneath his desk. The emergency system test scheduled that week showed green status across all checkpoints. The Academy security team celebrated. Another perfect score. Only Eddie noticed the half-second delay between alert trigger and response time, a gap that hadn't existed in previous tests. He documented this in his notebook, then approached Captain Reynolds directly. "Sir, we've got blind spots developing. Systematic, not random." Reynolds had smiled politely. "Eddie, we just upgraded to the TAC Secure 9000, military-grade encryption, triple redundancies." If there were issues, the system would alert us. Not if the system itself is the target, Eddie replied. The captain's smile had tightened. I think you're overthinking this. But tell you what, submit your concerns through the proper channels. The proper channels, the same ones already ignoring his warnings. That night, Eddie walked the perimeter alone, flashlight sweeping across ground that had known his footsteps for years. Near the drainage culvert, he found what the cameras had missed. A small disturbance in the soil, recent boot prints not matching academy issue, and a single fiber caught on the fence mesh. He photographed the evidence with his personal phone, wrote detailed notes, filed another report. It joined the others unread in digital limbo. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Eddie was repairing the old security keypad outside the eastern barracks, a task no one had assigned him, but that needed doing. The keypad had been malfunctioning for weeks. Cadets had reported it. Maintenance had logged it. Nothing had happened. So Eddie brought his tools and went to work. He knelt there, methodically testing connections, when polished boots appeared beside him. Lieutenant Carter, uniform pressed to perfection, stood watching with barely concealed amusement. Need help, old man? The question carried no genuine offer, only mockery wrapped in false concern. Eddie continued working, focused on the exposed wiring. No, sir, Carter corrected, his voice carrying across the quad where several cadets had paused to watch. We do still use rank around here. Eddie looked up then, his movements unhurried. His eyes, clear and steady, met Carter's. Didn't realize gate duty required salutes. Carter leaned closer, voice dropping but edge sharpening. Everything requires respect, especially from the help. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Several cadets shifted their weight. A young officer approaching changed course, suddenly remembering business elsewhere. Eddie slowly returned his tools to their case, each movement deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried effortlessly across the stillness. Respect isn't given by stripes, Lieutenant. It's revealed by silence. Carter's face flushed. Yeah, well, silence doesn't stop intruders. Eddie closed, his toolbox with a soft click. Neither does noise without purpose. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in Carter's eyes, recognition perhaps that the exchange had not gone as planned. Then he turned sharply and walked away, barking, orders at nearby cadets who'd been watching. That evening, Cadet Bennett found Eddie at his usual post, reading weather reports with the same calm attention he gave everything. I heard what happened, she said. Eddie nodded slightly. Words. Just words. His or yours? She asked. Eddie looked up then, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. Does it matter? It happened on a Thursday just before dusk. As the academy prepared for evening drills, the perimeter system glitched, only for a moment, a flicker on the southeast camera. Most would have missed it. Eddie didn't. He rewound the feed, eyes narrowing. A shadow moved where it shouldn't have. No sound, no alert, just a quiet disturbance near the tree line. He called it in. Possible breach, southeast quadrant, recommend inspection. Lieutenant Carter's voice crackled back, dismissive. No confirmation, probably just a raccoon. We're not chasing ghosts, Eddie. But Eddie didn't laugh. Instead, he signed out for a maintenance sweep and walked the perimeter with his flashlight. The air was damp, heavy, still. He found what he was looking for near the drainage culvert, footprints. Not cadet boots. Civilian. Deep and recent. Too fresh to ignore. The next day he filed a silent report. Not through official channels, he knew better. Just a folded note on Langston's desk. Fence line compromised, internal systems blind. There was no response. But that night the breach returned. 2 figures slipped through the blind spot, quiet, precise, gone before alarms. Triggered. And Eddie, watching from his booth, knew in his bones. This wasn't practice anymore. For 3 nights, he documented the patterns, same approach vector, same timing, same careful movements that spoke of planning and precision. His notebook filled with timestamps, path projections, response scenarios. He requested additional patrols. Request denied. On the 4th night, Eddie didn't wait for permission. He positioned himself near the drainage culvert, perfectly still, a shadow among shadows. When the figures appeared, moving with practiced coordination toward the command building, he simply watched, noted their equipment, their communication pattern, their objective. Then he disappeared before they did, silent as mist, back to his booth where he made a single phone call. Not to Academy security, not to Lieutenant Carter, to a number he hadn't dialed in years. "Sentry," he said quietly. "West position compromised." On the other end, silence. Then, "Acknowledged, Commander." The drainage culvert cut beneath the southeast corner of the Academy grounds. A concrete passage 8 feet in diameter, designed to channel storm runoff away from the campus. On blueprints, it appeared as a simple utility feature. To Eddie, it was the Academy's greatest vulnerability. For 3 consecutive nights, he'd stationed himself in the shadows nearby, watching as the automated patrols passed at precisely the same time, following precisely the same pattern, predictable, exploitable. At exactly 23:17 each night, there would be a 43-second window when neither cameras nor guards covered this section. Tonight, Eddie arrived early, positioning himself where the tree line met the perimeter fence. The moon hung thin and partial, casting just enough light to silhouette movement without revealing details. Perfect conditions for those who preferred darkness. At 23:09, the figures appeared. 2 of them moving with military precision toward the culvert entrance. Their gear was non-standard but familiar to Eddie's experienced eye. Not amateurs, not vandals, professionals with specific intent. Eddie remained motionless as they approached the fence. One carried equipment that immediately disabled the nearby sensor. The other produced tools that made short work of the access panel controlling the drainage grate. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their movements conveyed years of shared operations, a language Eddie recognized because he'd once taught it. Himself, as they slipped into the culvert, Eddie noted the mud they tracked, the slight displacement of gravel, the nearly imperceptible fiber snagged on the grate's edge. Evidence the automated systems wouldn't register, but that told a complete story to trained eyes. When they disappeared inside, Eddie did something that would have shocked Lieutenant Carter. He didn't pursue, didn't trigger alarms. Instead, he documented their entry point, their approach path, and their timing. Then he quietly retraced his steps to his security booth. There, he added precise notes to his growing file, not just observations, attack scenarios, response protocols, countermeasures for exactly this type of infiltration. The report he filed that night went to General Langston directly. Southeast culvert breach 23:17. Professional team. 3rd consistent penetration. Full assessment attached. The 4th breach came with no warning, no blaring alarms, no red lights, just a blackout. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Worthington Military Academy went dark. Power failed across the campus. Cameras dropped. Gates froze. For 13 full minutes, the entire security system was blind. Cadets stirred in their bunks. Lights flickered, but never returned. Some thought it was a drill. Others suspected a storm. Only one man understood the truth before anyone else did. Eddie Jameson was already standing. He hadn't slept. He never did during storms. While others scrambled for flashlights, Eddie was walking the north fence line. Rain slicked his coat. The wind bit into his bones, but his steps were sure. At the southeast culvert, he stopped. Footprints again, but this time different. He knelt, pressed his hand to the muddy ground. The imprint was fresh, deep. Not one pair, 2. And they weren't running. They were coordinated. He reached for his radio. Static, the blackout had severed comms. So he moved swiftly, silently across campus. Lieutenant Carter shouted orders in the dark. Secure the barracks. Lock down the mess hall. Get me a status report. But there was no status, no visibility, no control. And that's when Carter realized something chilling. He wasn't in charge anymore. No one was. At 2:34 a.m., the emergency generator finally kicked in. Lights surged back on, but it was already too late. The intruders were gone. No evidence left behind, but a broken latch and a deactivated sensor still blinking red. Carter stormed into the control room, barking demands, furious and humiliated. "Who let this happen?" The answer came not from the staff, but from a notebook Eddie placed on the console, open to a page with precise times, locations and breach patterns charted over a week. "You were warned," he said simply. "You chose not to listen." Carter's face flushed. "You should have told me directly." Eddie met his gaze. "I did." The control room fell silent. Carter stood frozen, Eddie's notebook open before him. Page after page of meticulous documentation, breach points, timing patterns, equipment assessments, all predicted with unsettling accuracy. The 13 minutes of darkness hadn't been a surprise to Eddie. They'd been an inevitability he'd been reporting for weeks. 3 separate reports, Eddie said quietly. 5 verbal warnings, 1 direct note left on your desk. Officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Technicians suddenly found their monitors fascinating. Carter's jaw tightened as he flipped through. Pages that should have been impossible. Detailed drawings of the intruders' approach vectors. Equipment specifications that matched what security cameras had briefly captured. Timestamps accurate to the second. "This is," Carter began. "Standard threat assessment," Eddie finished for him. "Just not digital, not automated, not ignored." General Langston entered, her presence immediately commanding attention. She surveyed the room, noted the notebook, and nodded almost imperceptibly to Eddie. "Status report," she demanded. Carter straightened. "Ma'am, we experienced a system-wide failure lasting approximately 13 minutes. Preliminary analysis suggests targeted intrusion," Eddie interrupted. "Professional team. 3rd successful breach. Objective, system vulnerability assessment." Did Carter's face reddened. "That's speculation. We have no evidence. Southeast culvert access," Eddie continued, turning pages in his notebook. 2-person team, military movement patterns, counter-surveillance awareness. They weren't here to steal. They were here to prove they could enter. Langston took the notebook, scanned several pages. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes betrayed recognition. "Lieutenant," she said to Carter without looking up, "why wasn't this intelligence acted upon?" Before Carter could form a response, Eddie spoke one final time. "Because it came from just Eddie," he said. "The old man at the gate. No convoy, no ceremony, just a black sedan and a folder tucked under her arm. General Langston arrived at Worthington Academy the morning after the blackout with purpose. In her stride, she walked straight into the security office, where Carter stood reviewing the overnight logs again, desperately searching for some defense, some excuse. Langston didn't ask permission. She spoke clearly. "You dismissed multiple warnings." Carter stiffened. "We had no verified threat." "You had Eddie Jameson." He flinched. "With all due respect, he's a gate guard." Langston opened the folder. Inside lay a single photo, a younger man, sharper jaw, darker hair, but unmistakably Eddie. He stood beside Langston years ago, both in full combat gear. "Then why," she said, laying the photo on the desk, "is he standing next to me in Afghanistan as my commanding officer?" The room went still. Carter's face drained of color. "What?" Langston's tone didn't shift. "He led Black Ops in 3 regions. Built the threat response doctrine you skimmed in basic. The only reason this place isn't on the news is because a man you dismissed still did the job you were too proud to learn." She closed the folder. You've been relieved of security oversight, effective immediately." Outside, Eddie stood at the gate as usual, nodding at each cadet who passed. Only now the nods came back with more weight, more hesitation, more understanding. Cadet Arya approached with a small, quiet salute. "Sir," she said, voice firm, "they're saying you wrote the engagement manuals we use." Eddie gave a small shrug. "Someone had to." She smiled. "Then maybe it's time we actually read them." The photograph lay on Carter's desk like a live grenade, faded at the edges, dust-stained, but unmistakably authentic. There stood Eddie Jameson, not stooped, not hesitant, but commanding. Combat fatigues bearing colonel's insignia, tactical gear positioned with precision, eyes alert and evaluating the harsh mountain terrain. And beside him, a younger General Langston, then a captain looking to him for direction. The timestamp, in the corner, 2003, Operation Mountain Viper, a classified mission that had become legendary among special operations communities. A mission led by a commander whose name had been redacted from official reports. A phantom who had engineered the extraction of 37 hostages without firing a single shot. That phantom now checked IDs at the West Gate. Carter couldn't stop staring at the image. The Eddie in the photograph stood with the natural authority that comes from absolute competence. Men followed this Eddie not because of rank, but because doing otherwise meant death. This Eddie had planned operations that changed war doctrine. This Eddie had been Langston's commanding officer, the woman who now commanded an entire military district. More photos emerged from the folder. Eddie receiving a commendation from a 3-star general. Eddie in dusty fatigues consulting maps with officials whose faces were blurred for security. Eddie standing at attention while medals were pinned to his chest. "He was Ghost 6, Langston said quietly. "The architect of the silent perimeter doctrine your academy teaches in third-year tactical. His threat assessment methodology is standard training at Quantico." Carter's voice, when he finally found it, came out small. "Why is he working a gate?" Langston's expression didn't change. He requested it, said he wanted to serve where he could still see what others miss. When Carter left the office, the world had shifted. The old man at the gate was no longer just Eddie. He was Colonel Edward Jameson, the ghost of Mountain Viper, the legend who had chosen to become invisible. They didn't call it a ceremony. No speeches, no flag folding. Just a briefing in the Academy's main hall. Mandatory attendance, but every seat was filled. Cadets sat in silence. Officers stood in the back. The podium remained empty longer than expected. Then General Langston entered. She didn't bring charts. She brought a name. "Edward Jameson," she began. "Some of you knew him as just Eddie, a man you overlooked, a man you dismissed." She let the silence settle before continuing. "You mocked experience, you ignored pattern, and you almost paid the price. No one dared move. He prevented a breach, with no weapons, no rank, no title, just judgment earned over decades, judgment that was silenced by ego." Then she stepped back, and Eddie walked in. Same uniform, same quiet steps. He said nothing at first, just looked out at the room that had once seen him as invisible. "I didn't stop the breach to prove anything," he said finally. "I did it because it was my post, and you protect what's in front of you." A pause. "That's what leadership is. Not shouting, not medals. It's knowing who's watching when you're not looking." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And if any of you want to learn that, really learn it, I'll be at the gate." The room remained silent long after he left. Carter stared at the floor. Other officers exchanged glances. But the cadets, they looked different. Something had shifted in their understanding. Later that week, a new sign was mounted at the west entrance. Jameson Post, in honor of steadfast watch. Eddie didn't ask for it, didn't even comment. But when he passed it, coffee in hand, he did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled just a little. They painted the sign in academy colors, navy blue with gold lettering, simple, dignified, understated. Jameson Post now marked the west entrance where Eddie had stood vigilant for years. Beneath it, in smaller letters, in honor of steadfast watch, cadets began treating the area differently. No more tossing empty coffee cups near the gate. No more cutting corners across the grass. A certain reverence settled over the post. Not because of the sign, but because they finally understood what it represented. Eddie continued his routine, unchanged by recognition. Same thermos, same notebook, same 3 taps on the gate each morning. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Around him, salutes came first from cadets now, not as an afterthought. Questions about perimeter security were asked with genuine interest. Lieutenant Carter avoided the West Gate entirely. His reassignment to administrative duties became the subject of quiet conversation, but never in Eddie's presence. Respect had finally found its proper home. One morning, Cadet Bennett lingered after her ID check. "Sir, we're studying perimeter security protocols this semester. Would you consider speaking to our class?" Eddie considered this, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Not about your service record," she added quickly. "Just about what you see, what you've observed here." For a moment, Eddie remained silent, gazing past her toward the tree line he'd watched for so long. "Thursday," he finally said. 800, I don't need slides." Word spread quickly. By Thursday, the classroom overflowed with cadets and even junior officers, all waiting for the old man who'd once been invisible. When Eddie entered, no one spoke. He carried no materials, just his notebook. For the next hour, he taught them to see what had always been in front of them, the patterns they'd missed, the signs they'd ignored, the quiet language of security that required no technology. Eddie never said goodbye, no announcement, no farewell lunch. One morning, the West Gate simply opened without him. A note was left behind, folded neatly on the desk. "The watch never ends. It just changes hands." And with that, he was gone. They searched for him at first, called, emailed. No answer. But every cadet, every officer knew it wasn't a disappearance. It was a passing of the torch. Cadet Aria Bennett now stood where Eddie once did. Same posture, same steady gaze. And beside her, pinned inside the booth, was Eddie's notebook, open to the final page. 6 words. "Respect is earned in silence daily." No lectures, no doctrine, just a sentence that had become scripture. Months passed. New cadets arrived. They heard the stories. How a quiet gate guard once outsmarted intruders, saved the compound, and humbled leadership with a single notebook. Most thought it was just legend until they met Aria, until they saw how she paused before every decision, how she walked the fence before sunrise, how she trained new guards not in tactics, but in patience. She never raised her voice, but somehow they listened. On a quiet spring afternoon, a black SUV stopped briefly at the gate. An older man in a worn coat stepped out just long enough to leave something at the post, a box wrapped in canvas. Inside, a folded uniform, untouched, and a note scribbled in familiar handwriting. "For whoever watches next, make it count." No return address, no signature, just a legacy they never saw coming but would never forget. It took 6 months for Cadet Bennett to become Lieutenant Bennett. Her promotion came with little fanfare, but much significance. The youngest officer ever, assigned to Academy security. Some whispered that strings had been pulled. Those who knew better understood merit when they saw it. Her office now occupied the small space beside the West Gate. Where others would have requested reassignment to command headquarters, Bennett insisted on remaining at Jameson Post. "The perimeter is where it matters," she told the review board. "Everything else is reaction." Eddie's notebook remained her most prized possession. Not a relic, but a living document that she continued to update daily. Her handwriting alongside his, 2 generations of vigilance, tracking the same patterns, noting the same cycles. Lieutenant Carter, still buried in administrative work, avoided her. The few times they crossed paths, he nodded stiffly. She returned the gesture without malice. Eddie had taught her that grudges distracted from what mattered. What truly set Bennett apart wasn't her technical knowledge or tactical training. It was how she'd inherited Eddie's way of seeing, the ability to notice what others missed. Cadets now competed for rotations under her command. Her security assessments became required reading for senior officers. "What did he teach you?" General Langston asked during a routine inspection. Bennett considered the question carefully before answering. "To listen for what isn't being said, to watch for what isn't moving, to respect what isn't announced." One evening, as she completed her perimeter walk, a young cadet approached nervously. "Lieutenant, is it true that Colonel Jameson left you his medals?" Bennett smiled slightly. "No, he left something far more valuable." "What?" "The understanding that leadership isn't about who you were, it's about who you watch over." Lieutenant Bennett began each day at 04:30, a full hour before her shift officially started. While the academy slept, while even the most dedicated cadets still dreamed, she walked the perimeter alone. Winter mornings brought frost that crunched beneath her boots. Summer dawns offered fog that concealed her movements like a protective cloak. But regardless of season, the ritual remained unchanged. She'd start at the west gate, Jameson Post, and move counterclockwise, her flashlight beams sweeping methodically across the fence line. Where others might have hurried through the cold or darkness, Bennett moved with deliberate patience. Every 20 paces she'd stop, listen, observe, note. The cadets who occasionally spotted her from barracks windows spread rumors about what she was doing. Some thought she performed secret security drills. Others believed she searched for weaknesses in the perimeter. A few suggested she communicated with Eddie Jameson somehow, receiving guidance from the man who'd vanished as mysteriously as he'd once appeared. The truth was simpler, but more profound. In these quiet moments before the academy awoke, Bennett learned to see the grounds as Eddie had, not as a collection of buildings and barriers, but as a living system with patterns and rhythms. She noted which birds returned to which trees, how dew collected differently on the eastern slope, where shadows lingered longest in early light. Nothing escaped her attention. The faint depression in soil near the southeast culvert, the slight discoloration on the third fence panel past the north tower, the way certain sections of grass grew at different rates, suggesting what lay beneath. By the time her official shift began at 05:30, she'd already compiled mental notes that would fill her own growing collection of notebooks. The other officers never asked why she sacrificed sleep for this solitary patrol. Those who understood didn't need to ask. Those who didn't wouldn't understand the answer. A year to the day after Eddie Jameson vanished from Worthington Academy, a black SUV pulled up to the west gate. The driver never emerged, never identified himself. A weathered courier box appeared on the security desk just inside Jameson Post. Lieutenant Bennett found it during morning rounds. Simple cardboard wrapped in canvas, secured with twine that had seen better days. No address, no return information. Just her name written in a hand she recognized immediately. She waited until after hours to open it, alone in the security booth as darkness settled over the academy grounds. The twine came apart easily. The canvas unfolded to reveal a box containing objects few would consider valuable. A security badge, its lamination yellowed with age. The name E. Jameson, barely visible beneath years of sun exposure. A thermos, the same one he'd carried daily, dented on one side from a fall years ago. 3 stone pebbles, smooth and dark, collected from places she could only guess. A compass, antique and perfectly functional, its needle pointing true north. Without hesitation, and beneath it all, something that made her breath catch, a medal, not just any medal. The Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. No documentation accompanied it, none was needed. A single note lay folded at the bottom, written in the same precise handwriting that filled the notebook she now carried. For whoever watches next, make it count. She held the medal briefly, feeling its weight, not just the physical heft, but the responsibility it represented. Then she carefully returned it to the box, placed everything back inside, and secured it in the small safe beneath the security desk. The medal wasn't meant for display. Just as Eddie himself had never needed recognition, the token of his past remained private, a reminder not of glory, but of duty. Eddie Jameson was never one for speeches. He never told people to respect him, never demanded loyalty, never once said, "I used to be somebody." But he didn't have to, because every day, in every quiet choice, he lived by 5 words he never spoke aloud. Be steady. Speak only when needed. He showed it when he stood at the gate in pouring rain, even when no one noticed. He showed it when he didn't lash back at the laughter. He showed it when he warned them gently, quietly, of the breach they chose not to believe. And he showed it most clearly when, after the truth came out, he refused the spotlight, refused the title. He didn't need to reclaim his rank. He had already reclaimed their respect. At Worthington Academy, they still call it Jameson Post. New cadets are told the story during orientation, not through a slideshow or a commemorative plaque, but by walking the perimeter at dawn in silence, just like Eddie did. Lieutenant Bennett keeps his notebook sealed behind glass, not to preserve it, but to remind everyone that leadership isn't loud. It listens, it waits, it watches, and when it speaks, it means something. So no, Eddie Jameson never said the 5 words, but the E Academy still echoes with them. In every pause before judgment, in every salute offered first, in every young leader who learns silence earned through service, carries more weight than any command. The story of Eddie Jameson transformed Worthington Academy. What began as one man's quiet vigilance became an institutional philosophy. 5 years after Lieutenant Bennett assumed her post, the Academy introduced a new course requirement: observational leadership. Cadets weren't taught to command from the front, but to understand from within. Leadership candidates now spent 1 week each semester working perimeter security, not as punishment, but as privilege. They learned to walk the fence line at varying hours, to document patterns others missed, to distinguish between routine and anomaly without technology's assistance. They learned that before you can direct others, you must first see what they cannot. The Westgate security booth became a rotation point for officer training. Time at the post entered the Academy lexicon as shorthand for development of situational awareness. Graduation speeches no longer celebrated only achievement and ambition, but patience and perception. Lieutenant Carter eventually transferred to another base. His departure went largely unmarked, except by Bennett, who offered a respectful salute as his car passed through the West Gate. Not out of protocol, but understanding. Everyone learns differently. Some require harder lessons. General Langston made just one change to the Academy's mission statement. Below paragraphs about excellence and tradition, she added a single line: "We listen before we lead." And somewhere, perhaps at another gate, at another facility requiring watchful eyes, an older man with weathered hands still carries a notebook, still notices what others miss, still teaches without speaking, because true leadership has never needed volume to carry weight, only the steady presence of someone paying attention when everyone else looks away.